Hello, Dr. Sinclair. Hello, Dr. De La Garza. Hello, Dr. Nath. This is Valentina Arada, and today I'm going to present my research proposal topic and the research design and methodology. The research is called Self-Exploration of a Project Leader's Career Tilt, Transformation and Motivational Challenges in the Face of a Mass Organizational Layoff. It's an organizational autoethnography about self-efficacy, leadership, and goal setting. This is the abstract, but I'm not going to read it, and I'm going to present the context of the problem. We know in the recent years, according to U.S. Bureau of Labor, there are on average 1.5 million layoffs in a month, culminating with March of 2020 with 21 million layoffs. These layoffs happen mainly due to downsizing. There is research about how to communicate the bad news or how the survivors of the layoffs manage to balance their work life, but we don't know how many of the employees are left to stay with their companies after the downsizing and how do they adapt to the dramatically changing culture. Since this is a problem coming from the real world, I would like to add some personal context and my rationale for this research. I'm a certified project leader with a high work standards and ethics. I successfully led and continue to do so teams of developers that build product technology for various organizations in the United States. I'm compassionate and I follow integrity, teamwork, and respect as ethical values. However, a couple of years ago, I witnessed a mass layoff due to downsizing at one of the organizations I worked for. That experience was traumatizing enough to trigger my engagement to this research, to tell the story, and let others relate and reflect to their similar stories. In the case of this research, the central story will be a mass layoff that took place before the age of COVID at a subsidiary office of a business corporation in the city of the Bluebonnet State. My story, approached in autoethnographic manner, will cover my experience during the layoff day, the tensions and frictions after the day, as well as my recovery after being let go. The layoff triggered a personal and professional transformation, and the intent is through personal reflection to further analyze the phenomena of career development, engagement, and motivation in an organizational culture undergoing financial and structural crisis. But with this being said, I would like to present further the problem statement. So this study will address the lack of organizational strategies to create those work supportive environments while downsizing, how to support career growth of the professional level for the layoff survivors, and ways to improve leadership strategies for communication and engagement with the layoff survivors throughout the downsizing process. So starting with the first statement on this problem statement, which is the lack of concern and support for employees' well-being resulting from the mass organizational layoff. When layoffs happen, survivors perceived unfairness and as most of the intense negative emotion. Considering Ladman's perspective that when employees feel unfairly treated, they respond with low commitment, and there is an increase in retaliation. Thus, creating supportive work environments becomes even more challenging throughout the downsizing process. Knower in 2009 proposes a 4-level organizational intervention model after the downsizing. And that model starts with the process of intervention, the grieving, the empowerment, and the system intervention. However, this model or other related research do not describe how to best manage the emotional side of the layoff survivors or what motivational mechanism employers should engage to maintain employees' commitment and productivity. As it relates to the second statement and this problem statement, which is the limited career growth opportunities of the professional level for the layoff survivors, understanding how to strategize career goals is important for employees' performance and efficiency, even more in a downsized organization. In the constant context of the layoff, according to a survey research ran by Wright Associates in 1992, layoff survivors are insecure not only about their future with the company, but about their future careers. When organizations are downsizing, careers and career planning become short-term and situational. Thus, career growth opportunities in a downsized organization are limited, and support for growth of the professional level could constitute a way to keep layoff survivors motivated and optimistic about their future with the organization or other organizations. As it relates to the third statement, this third segment in the problem statement, which is ineffective leadership strategies for communication and engagement with the layoff survivors throughout the downsizing process. According to House and Mitchell in 2007, accomplishing work goals and attaining work satisfaction is dependent of two factors. One, the personal characteristic of the subordinate, but the second one, which is important, is the environmental pressures and demands with which the subordinate must cope. To this extent, House outlines that when work environments are stressful and frustrating, subordinates' effort and satisfaction are enhanced by supportive leadership behavior that increases self-confidence and lowers stress and anxiety. However, there is limited research on the impact and influence on directive leadership behavior in the case of stressful work environments associated with organization downsizing. Now, in terms of research gaps, the first one is the lack of research on the topic of work values and behavior internalization in a dramatically changing culture. According to Deci and Ryan, humans are inherently active and intrinsically motivated and also capable to integrate. Thus, there is a significant influence on attitudes, value, motivations, and behaviors when performing in a social environment. Particularly in a workplace, autonomy supported work environments are highly related to performance and well-being if equitable pay is provided. In this context, there is little research on how attractive pay influences work values and behaviors in organizations undergoing organizational crisis. Therefore, this proposed research intends to contribute to this gap through self-reflection on the impact of non-supportive environments, even when the competitive pay is there in the context of a restructured organization. So in other words, is the pay enough to overcome one's well-being? The second research gap is actually a gap in time of the topic of career advancement and opportunity at the professional level in the times of organizational crisis. According to Ashford in 2012, individuals move opportunistically from one role to another with an organization or out of it, aligning their desire and qualification with available choices. Additionally, in 2020, Greco points out that professional identification can be mainly supported through career mentoring. Although career advancement in terms of career mentoring and professional identification has been researched at the organizational level, there is little research related to career advancement at the professional level in organization undergoing crisis, such as mass layoff. This proposed study will fill the above research gap by self-reflecting on the impact of career mentoring related to professional advancement in the light of career shifts due to professional trauma, such as layoff. The study will also explore the lack of support between career mentoring and professional identification. I will self-analyze in the context of dramatically changing culture. The third research gap relates to the lack of research on the topic of enhancing supportive leadership behavior to support commitment and motivation in a dramatically changing culture. Locke and Latman, who are the pioneers of goal-setting theory, support feedback and commitment to the goal and task complexity as key moderators for goal setting. People need feedback to track their progress, self-efficacy, and mastering. Factors like socialization and coaching promote goal orientation at the group level, discouraging individualistic performance. So, through self-reflection, this research will contribute to an overview of motivational strategies to unleash motivation and performance and involvement in a cultural crisis. In both problem statement and research gaps, you may have noticed some gaps in here for the research presented. One of the reasons is that major layoffs starting happening somewhere and become a concerning societal phenomena somewhere in the mid-80s. And then you will see that most of the research starts from mid-80s to today. And there is significant research in 2018, coming 1993, and obviously 2000. Now, as it relates to the research questions, first of all, the main phenomena analyzed in this research will be how my career was impacted by this mass layoff. Thus, the central research question is, how did mass organizational layoff impact my motivation and performance, career tilt, and personal transformation? The second question actually is, the second question aligns to the first problem statement as well as with the first research gap, is what were the challenges I experienced due to the perceived lack of concern and support for my well-being during the organizational mass layoff that impacted my motivation and performance? So related to this question, the intent is to describe the challenges and obstacles I encountered trying to adapt to the transformed culture after the mass layoff, to reflect on losing trust in the leadership and provide details on the lack of trust of my peers and team members in me as a project leader. In this sense, to contribute to the research gap of the work values and behavior internalization of the changing culture. How, although my pay was competitive, it was not enough to unleash my intrinsic motivation and overall engagement with the projects I led. Then the next question is, how did the limitations of career advancement resulting from the downsizing process impact my sense of confidence and performance? With this research question, I will be looking to describe and self-reflect on the lack of career advancement opportunities in the organization undergoing a major crisis such as a layoff, how my career growth was impacted by the crisis and the lack of coaching strategies for professional advancement. How, although I have been dedicated overperformer and ready to advance, career advancement wasn't an opportunity anymore. How the situation impacted my self-esteem and confidence in advancing to a leadership position, although at the personal and professional level, I was prepared for the role. The last question is, how did a lack of effective leadership communication strategies impact my motivation and performance? Concerning to this question, the aim is to describe ineffective leadership communication strategies, such as the performance review process, in the context of the changing organizational culture. The intent is to provide details on my performance review process after the mass layoff related to the disorienting goals I had to follow and the superficial feedback provided by my supervisor. I will reflect on the performance review process to the lenses of goal-setting theory, providing insights to the role of coaching in promoting goal orientation, a research gap, how the lack of coaching and mentoring had an impact on my performance and motivation. Now, in order to address and to further analyze these questions, I will be using this outline here framework, which has 4 themes. The first one is the effect of organizational environment on intrinsic motivation through self-determination. This actually comes from the self-determination theory from Deci and Ryan, who state that humans have evolved to be intrinsically driven and motivating, and at the same time geared to naturally develop through integrative processes from a culture organization perspective. Employees' performance is mainly affected by the time and motivation related to their job activities. The second theoretical lens I'm intending to use is the self-efficacy theory of Albert Bandura, as the action orientation influence on gaining leadership experience considers self-efficacy. And Bandura states that self-efficacy, by generating higher goals after achieving initial goals, increases self-esteem and is linked to increased involvement. The third theory is goal-setting theory, with the increased motivation and improved performance by setting achievable goals. Edwin Locke states that performance is optimized when goals are rather difficult, specific, and measurable, given the challenging goals enhance performance due to increased intrinsic motivation. So working towards a goal is considered a significant source of motivation. And the third theory it's my intent to use is the path goal theory of Robert House. It's the impact organizational environment on the leadership style. Leadership style should adapt to employees' skills and needs, the goal being to increase their motivation and satisfaction to be productive and align to their personal goals align their goals to the overall objectives of the group or organization. As you probably noticed, all these theories are motivational theories, and they are triggered to the central question of this research. Now, this is the conceptual theory, conceptual framework I'm intending to use. It's actually it aligns with the story I'm trying to tell. The intent is not to be chronological, but rather to help me outline the critical steps that happen in this journey, and also to outline the theoretical lenses I'm going to use throughout the process. So it first starts with the biggest trauma of the mass layoff day, and then generates lack of trust, disorienting goals, and the superficial feedback. And all these instances will be analyzed and self-reflected using goal-setting theory. Then all this lack of trust in those oriented goals actually generated my poor performance and then a low self-esteem, but also a drive to learn more, to get engaged into learning more about project management or go to school and things like that. So all this portion here will be self-analyzed and make relationships with self-efficacy theory. And then it further on, how my performance improved, how there is a drive for professional improvement, and all that relentless and drive for being competent, which will be analyzed with the lenses of self-determination theory. Now, in terms of the significance of this study, I was able to outline two areas, which is one of the practitioner perspective, but it's also a scholarly perspective. So in terms of the practitioner perspective, there are two entities that could, could benefit out of this research. The first are the employers who can learn or find out about ways to create work environments focused on employees' emotional needs rather than only processes or policies after the mass layoff. But also the second area will be the career growth aspects. And this is not only for the employees, but also it could be employees related, how to develop career planning and support strategies for professional growth at the employee level before the layoffs happen or throughout the layoff process. And then the third one touches on the leadership concepts, enhance leadership strategies to review employees' performance and provide feedback in an organization undergoing crisis. This can be slightly different than in an organization that's pretty healthy and organizational, well-stand. Now, in terms of the scholarly perspective, what will be the significance of the study? The first one relates to the gap I was trying to outline earlier related to work values and behavior internalization. In terms of how attractive pay influences work values and behaviors in times of crisis, this research will contribute to the existing literature by exploring the competency needs required for efficient performance in times of crisis. As discussed earlier, existing literature and research related to self-determination theory discuss how competency, autonomy, and relentlessness are key needs for human optimal development. But how these needs are attained in times of emotional distress is not discussed in the current literature. The third impact that this research could have is on the career advancement at professional level. There is literature about career advancement at a professional level, but this research will contribute to the body of knowledge about how career development, but also to the goal-setting theory of how to plan career goals and gain leadership efficacy in times of uncertainty. The third aspect is to adapt or enhance leadership style. In the case of adapting and enhancing this leadership style, this research will contribute to the existing literature by overcoming the gap in the path goal theory and related research on how leadership and subordinate relationship can significantly change in times of crisis. And the leadership strategies for communication and enhancement are to be reconsidered again when we discuss times of crisis, such as downsizing. Now, talking a little bit about my philosophical journey and how actually it landed to the research method I chose. So it first starts with my perception of reality, which comes from a relativist view. The reality is the result of my interpretation of the changing cultural context. and knowledge is gathered by contextual circumstances. Now, in terms of how I gain knowledge or how knowledge comes in terms of my epistemology, that is through introspection, gaining knowledge by reflecting on my own experience, using self-reflection to analyze the contextual, organizational, cultural changes. And with both this ontology and epistemology of relativist introspection, my paradigm landing into being a constructivist paradigm, by generating meaning from my experience and patterns of learning others could embrace. And on top of this paradigm of constructivism is rather suitable to investigate on organizational phenomena. So with these lenses in mind, I landed to the methodology of qualitative methodology to describe the culture in an interpretative approach of the world, and the data collection being done through words, memory, or textual artifacts. So qualitative methodology, introspection, being a constructivist, I landed to autoethnography, and I would like to pause here for a second and to make a big difference between autobiography and autoethnography. So autobiography is a story written by and about oneself. It's a self-portrait, and it focuses on oneself for purposes of self-representation. However, autoethnography is placing the self within a social cultural context, in this case being an organizational culture. It's self-reflexive, it's vulnerable, it's a research method that uses storytelling, which accommodates and acknowledges subjectivity. The next, I'll pause here again, reading through the purpose statement of this research. So this is an autoethnographic study. This autoethnographic study aims to explore my experience as a project leader in the impact of the mass layoff on my personal and professional transformation. The intent is to examine the self through autobiographical lenses and explore personal behavior related to the cultural environment, which is a technology development subculture in the case of the study. My position will be closely examined from the inside to better analyze and critique the impact of lack of a supportive workplace, limited career growth opportunities, and poor leadership engagement on my personal and professional transformation. Okay, so now going farther, this is a quick overview of the research design. And here I would like to mention that I have landed to this research design, and this entire proposal starting with first telling the story of the mass layoff, which is the introductory chapter in my proposal. That story triggered this entire design and proposal. So that story had triggered this questions, and each of the questions, which I already described them later, will answer to the research gaps, to the problem statement, and will be analyzed through the theories I mentioned earlier. And here down, I'm aligning which of the stories will be written and self-explore way to answer to each of the questions. So like for the first question, which is, what were the challenges I experienced due to the perceived lack of concern and support for my well-being during the organizational mass layoff? The intent is to tell the story of, and reading here, the curse of the high pay, integrity at stake, Stephen is not here anymore, you are a coward. Writing the stories in an autoethnographical manner, exploring the perceived lack of well-being, supportability of survivors, and how work values and behaviors shift to a survival mode. The intent is also to use self-determination theoretical lenses to explore the shift in the factors triggering the intrinsic motivation in the times of cultural crisis, where employees could rather be focused on survival than performance. The second question being, how did the limitations of career advancement resulting from the downsizing process impact my sense of confidence and performance? Related to this question, the intent is to search for answers to the gap of career growth opportunities for the layoff survivors. And here the plan is to use goal-setting theory and self-efficacy theory to explore the limitation of career growth of the layoff survivors and how the lack of investment impacted not only my motivation at the time, but my self-efficacy in the long run as a project leader. And the stories that I'm planning to relate here will be my career tilt, which is a central story, as well as the new office graduation party and new career goals. As it relates to the third question, how did the lack of effective leadership communication strategies impact my motivation and performance? The intent is to search answers on leadership strategies for communication and engagement with the layoff survivors through the downsizing process. The main focus will be on the performance review story and how that was performed after the mass layoff, using path goal leadership theory to analyze leadership adaptability opportunities and possible shift leadership style from achievement-oriented to supportive. Going deeper down in the research method that I chose, it will be an evocative autoethnography, in the sense that evoke this emotional responses. Evocative ethnography is a genre of autoethnography that focuses on narrative presentation that open up conversations and evoke emotional responses. And in the case of the stories about this main layoff, the intent is to expose and to evoke this emotional aspects I've been challenged with. The second aspect of evocative ethnography is the personal and cultural urgency. The work of autoethnography expresses a personal and cultural urgency with a critical age, where autoethnographers compose stories that combine social aspects of life and literature. Obviously, the stories will not only describe my personal view, but will also describe the cultural, organizational, cultural changes and those powerful shifts from changing from the nice and friendly culture to a culture rather focused on profits. Also, autoethnography in general, but in particular, evocative autoethnography uses evoking feelings and connecting the reading to the audience, and resist that emotional distancing of the third person voice of the traditional research. So in other words, autoethnography is more pertaining to talking on a personal voice rather than a third person spectator voice that traditional research uses. So these are some characteristics of evocative autoethnography, and the reason I inclined to this research method. In terms of participant observation in the setting, so I will be the only participant in this research. The time will be before the age of COVID. The place is a city in the Bluebonnet State. The setting is a fast-moving consumer good organization, and the subculture is a technology development subculture. And you will see throughout my presentation, the reason I'm not mentioning the time and the place is obviously for confidentiality reasons. Now, in terms of data collection, as I said earlier, the self will be the primary data source. It will be data collection will be through evocative writing, self-reflection, and introspection. I will be using techniques such as heuristic journaling, using my memory recollection. But also, I will be having as fill notes some performance review forms, emails, and a few pictures, as well as recalled formal and informal communication. A little bit about heuristic journaling. The reason I will be using some of the techniques there is because heuristic journaling pertains to understanding human experience. The focus is exclusively and continually aimed to understand the human experience. Generates a comprehensive story. It's the life experience in a heuristic journaling is not a text to be read or interpreted. It's a comprehensive story that's portrayed in an alive and meaningful language, which is actually storytelling. And it's a conscious perception. It's a perception that doesn't always accurately describe what is present in our consciousness. We can easily perceive properties of a thing that does not possess, which the storytelling in all my self-reflection will be my perception to what has happened. Again, into a little bit more tactical into the heuristic journaling approach. So when writing the stories, I will be using this framework. Starting first with an overview of the experience explored, such as the career tilt or the performance review. Describe that experience in detail, reflect on the experience and its impact, and then continue with a self-exploration of any unresolved feelings of how I felt. And then, based on self-exploration, determine themes and patterns for interpretation and reflection. And then look for themes, interpret the experience in the context of the research questions, and reflect on how the experience contributed to my personal growth or transformation. The self of the researcher is present throughout the process, and while understanding the phenomenon with increasing depth, the researcher also experiences growing self-awareness and self-knowledge. So this is the reason the intent is to use this heuristic journaling approach. Now, in terms of memory recollection, which will be an aspect is an aspect actually of autoethnography, subjectivity and temporality play a significant role in what and how we remember things. Memory recollection of the events is to identify patterns of thought, talk, feeling, and action. There will be descriptive notes of my observation as dialogue and portrait of the participants, a reflective notes of detailed personal thoughts and feelings of the experience and the events considered. Memory in itself is an interpretative, subjective, and open to various explanations. The intent is to pursue memory recollection, to bring in my observations and dialogue and the portrait of the participant as much as I can recall to my memory. Now, in terms of storytelling and vignettes, autoethnography's mantra is show rather than tell. The focus being on dialogue, action, and gesture. So the plan is to focus on the traumatic tension and the character development. either is my character or the other characters in the organization. Make characters complex, not simply good or bad. Use dialogue to advance character development, and get inside of the experience, write about it, then review from outside, re-experience, and then re-edit to produce a good personal narrative. It will be an ongoing writing process, and it will be write a coherent and compelling story. So the idea with show rather than tell is not to be that explicit in my writing of what has happened, but rather guide the reader to the intensity of the trauma that happened to not only to the layoff day, but the days after after the layoff, and what was the trauma I have experienced as a layoff survivor. Now, in terms of bracketing my bias, using reflexive bracketing is intended to help us to identify our perspectives and to examine them. This is an ongoing reflection on our own engagement with our collection analysis of the data, often is referred to as reflexive, stressing one's looking back and inward in a self manner. So here, some strategies to mitigate to my bias would be first to acknowledge my values at a personal and professional level, as I was stating in the beginning of the presentation, to integrity, teamwork. Balance, passion, and discipline, take subjectivity to the extreme and reflect on others' similar experience to root meanings completely. And then the third aspect is to critically assess and suspend any personal motives or values that will negatively impact the story characters or influence the research analysis and findings. So here, the intent is to tell the stories and to express the intensity of the trauma, but not to be a disgruntled employee or to point fingers on my previous supervisor or the organization. That's not the intent to have any negative impact on the characters. Now, in terms of data management and analysis, the autoethnographic research process is not linear. Instead of research steps overlap, sometimes returning to the previous steps, one activity modifies and informs another. So in autoethnography, analyzing that data is an ongoing event. There is an ongoing reflection process. And mentioned above, the main data sources of the research will be my memories, personal journals, emails, posters, and recall information, recall formal and informal communication. The autoethnographic research process is iterative in nature. It involves revisiting and rethinking the data, which means is systematically collected, verified, analyzed, and further reflected. This process systematically directs research efforts to the ultimate goal of socio-cultural discovery. Data management facilitates data analysis and interpretation. In autoethnography, the process of analysis is emergent and unpredictable, interpreting the self-behaviors in the cultural context. The data interpretation focuses on finding cultural meanings beyond the data. So in other words, it all starts with my memories, journaling, and field notes, but then it's organizing, refining, and then outlining, and come up with findings and interpretation. But all the findings and interpretation will be gathered to either existing literature or to the theoretical lenses I have outlined earlier, or that could be other emerging theoretical lenses based on the data interpretation. Making sense of data here more aligns with like a theoretical conceptualization of the data. The first aspect is of inferred practical and theoretical assertion. So obviously, the intent is not to formulate theory because there is limited observational data and it's one person only. But I will look to infer assertions for practice, research, and theory. For instance, from the goal setting theory, we know that setting goals is partially dependent on goal commitment, task complexity, and feedback being determinant. However, the perceived feedback or the feedback provided throughout the layoff process to the survivors and how their motivation productivity is impacted, this could be an assertion. What were the implications on one's leadership self-efficacy after the layoff? Now, frame with theory. The chosen theories will guide my process of data organization, analysis, and interpretation, as well as the structure of the writing. For instance, the performance review process after the mass layoff will be analyzed through the lens of the goal-setting theory and the implications of providing or not providing relevant feedback. Another aspect of framing with theory is how competitive pay isn't enough to drive competency and performance. And the third aspect is connections with existing literature, connect my stories with the ongoing cultural and academic as well as theoretical approach related to human life. Reflecting and analyzing the story by making connection with existing literature on the topic, but also by referring human behavior and my personal values. My findings and self-reflection will be compared and contrasted with existing literature, theory, and personal experiences. In terms of quality assurance, three aspects I'll be taking in consideration. The first one is a statement of credibility. Although storytelling about traumatizing experience can be rather therapeutical, as a researcher, I acknowledge my vulnerability by revealing the strong emotions I felt throughout the layoff crisis. My self-reflection is intentional and will help employees and employers better understand and empathize with the crisis impact on one's performance and involvement. The second aspect is verisimilitude, the effect of reality. With an evocative autoethnography, the intent is to bring the reader to the reality that it is not only emotionally impactful, but which captures the dialogue and intensity of how layoff is perceived from different angles. It connects the reader to the writers and provides continuity of their lives. Bias in autoethnography. Related to the researcher's bias, my bias in this research, which is hard to avoid as a storyteller and participant in organizational culture, Herman in 2022 states that autoethnography is one of the few places in scholarship where researchers' voice is explicitly allowed. Thus, I acknowledge my lens as a passionate workaholic, born and raised in an Eastern European culture with a graduate education in the United States. My bias will be thus anchored in my past, recognizing and acknowledging them in the way the stories will be recollected. In the terms of my autoethnography sense, the reason I chose autoethnography as a research method is that I believe this approach will allow the readers to be inspired by my reflection on my experience throughout the layoff. My hope is that others who have been through similar experiences would rather shift their mindset from victim to survivor and focus on their career improvement rather than their resentment towards their former employers. Now, in terms of possible limitations, the first one is the dual role of the storyteller and researcher. Being the storyteller and researcher at the same time will add complexity to the research process in the sense of writing and reflecting with a different mindset. How I'm planning to mitigate this limitation. First, as a storyteller, I will deep dive into my memory recollection to impart the intensity of my perception of the prolonged layoff experience. And then, as a researcher, I will detach from the emotional side of the stories and conceptually codify and categorize the meanings and findings while aligning to the research questions as well as theoretical and proposed conceptual frameworks. Now, in terms of memory recollection of the events, the scenography will be highly based on the memory recollection. So I'm committing in this order, I'm committed to stay focused on outlining the intensity of the dialogue and events as clearly as I remember them. And how I'm going to mitigate through this limitation is bracketing my bias by acknowledging my values, personal and professional, and critically assessing and suspending any personal motives or values that would negatively impact the story character or the influence of this research analysis and findings. Further down, as it relates to the ethical considerations, although there are no participants in this study other than myself, I will seek university's approval for this research by submitting a comprehensive details for this research IRB approval. In terms of confidentiality, one of the ethical concerns to mitigate to this research will be disclosing sensitive information. From this perspective, I'll ensure no data or information internal to the company or the company will not be mentioned or provided. I will be using pseudonyms for the characters to not generate any harm of those mentioned or for the company referred in the study. In terms of credibility, starting with its purpose and the entire research process of storytelling, analyzing, and reporting the findings will be probed with honesty and trustworthiness. And there's a possible risk. One of them would be that the company and the main characters could be identified. How I'm planning to mitigate to this, first, the company in its structure as a group entity has been dissolved. That company does not exist any longer. The managers and leadership could be recognized, but the way to mitigate to this risk is to use pseudonyms. The other risk could be my vulnerability, exposing myself of losing a job at one point, accepting the find and acknowledging that others may judge my experience. The intent is, in this sense, being for others to relate to the story instead, not necessarily to judge. But I acknowledge I put myself out there and thus I become vulnerable. Emotional introspection, going back in the past and opening memories that I forced myself to forget back when the layoff happened, could generate possible depressing, getting to some sort of depression. But how we'll mitigate to this is keep communicating and opening up and make a different differentiation between facts, what has happened, in my emotions. Writing possible issues with memory recollection and writing in a manner that evokes emotion. I'll continue to write and deep dive on how I felt and rephrase and rewrite the stories where necessary. Now, in terms of how this study will be organized, the first chapter will be my career tale, which I already started working on it, and that will cover the journey from the day of the mass layoff to the day of my layoff a year later, and describe that in terms of personal and professional transformation. A second chapter is developing the study, which will provide an introduction and context of the problem, research gaps, problem, and purpose statements, and will be followed by research questions, theoretical and conceptual frameworks. Then chapter 3 will be the literature review. Chapter 4, describing the methodology, will be discussing the autoethnography research methods and procedures in terms of research design. Then chapter 5 will be a project leader transformation, will be a self-reflective approach of my memoirs during the transformation process, covering additional center narratives on how I integrated to the new culture while determining the drive for professional growth. And this chapter will be covering all the stories outlined earlier in the research design to answer to the research questions. And the last chapter will be my learnings and findings as a project leader, which will cover the analysis of the research questions that guided the study and findings of the self-reflection of my transformation, and how I embraced changes given the trauma of the mass layoff and the other key events that follow. Reflection of the experience will be done through theory and as well as existing literature on the topic. Now, this is a timeline I'm planning to work towards, and I wanted to share with you, to kind of outline key milestones in the process. And I will pause here. I thank you for your time and for being part of this journey, and I'm obviously open for any questions and suggestions. Thank you.